Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 5 of the 17th annual Transforming the Teaching and Learning Environment virtual conference. I'm Bob Hales. I'm your moderator. Sorry, you're stuck with me. Keep in mind, our sponsor this year is the Journal of Educators Online. It just so happens today at noon Central, they're going to do a brief thing with the journal, talk about how you might be able to participate in it and so forth. It's on the schedule, so it'd be nice if you dropped in at least for a few minutes with them. We have with us this morning Ali Salzman. She's an instructor in the English and Reading Department at Madison Area Technical College, where she teaches a variety of courses. They include creative writing, professional writing, and composition courses. She's previously at Texas State University and Austin Community College. She's going to talk about helping learners thrive, building community through emotion and storytelling. Sounds interesting. Allie, it's all yours.
All right. Thank you. And welcome everybody. Thank you for being here. I really appreciate the opportunity to present at the TTLE conference. Um, I'm I know Bob just went over this, but Ali Salzman, I'm in the English reading department at Madison Area Technical College, and previously taught at Texas State University and Austin Community College before I came to this institution. So, um, I've been interested in this idea for a while, and I'm really happy to be able to share some of the research and that other people are interested in this topic too, because I primarily teach writing classes. That's the bulk of my course load. And as a writing instructor, I felt pretty lucky because I get to learn so much about my students through their writing. And I get to spend a lot of time talking about, infusing emotion into our writing through different rhetorical tools and things, for example. And after years of teaching, after a while, I started noticing how much emotion and storytelling just sort of happened naturally and organically in the classroom. And I started to wonder if there were any benefits. So I started to look toward the research. So the first part of this presentation will be really research heavy. I'll just kind of go quickly through some research. And then I'll talk about practical ideas and examples to include storytelling and emotion in the classroom, and talk about storytelling best practices. And then we'll have the opportunity for sharing and for questions at the end. And I'm also going to qualify this by saying I'm not a social scientist or a psychologist or a neuroscientist. So I absolutely will be referring to the experts in these fields for some background information. And again, I'm going to try and move relatively quickly through this part so we can get to the practical examples. Um, so here I'll start in how I got interested. I read a book called The Spark of Learning, Energizing the College Classroom with the Science of Emotion by Sarah Rose Kavanagh, who's a psychologist professor at Simmons University. And she researches the intersections of emotion, motivation, and learning. So in her book, one of the central arguments is that if you want to grab the attention of your students, prolong their persistence, and permanently change how they see the world, and maximizes the chances that they'll retain the material you're teaching over the long term, then there's no better approach than to target their emotions. I found that last part particularly interesting, that it will help them retain the material for the long term. And she bases her claims on the foundations of affective science. She says affect is a word that encompasses not only emotional states, but also many other experiences that involve pleasure, displeasure, and physiological arousal, like motivation and physical pain. So it doesn't assume that our various emotions are discrete and separate entities, like Pixar's Inside Out, and more of a continuum. So to introduce this idea, Kavanagh talks about uses an example that Mary Helen Immortio Yang uses, an educational psychologist. Um, and she uses the example of Beth. And this is my stock photo Beth here. Um, but she says, Beth is a student solving a complicated physics problem. And apologies for if there are any physics instructors in here. I used the best stock photo I could find. Um, but one important question to begin investigating how emotions are already built into the educational process might be, what are Beth's motivations? What are the students' motivations? And why is the student trying to solve the problem at all? And so Immortio Yang uses this list and says, this student may be anticipating rewards like good grades, fear of parents' disapproval if she doesn't do well, an innate curiosity about the problem, desire for future career success, a worry that her skills aren't a match for the problem at hand, or even stereotype threat, for example, that women don't perform as well in math or science, or feeling reward or frustration for different steps of the problem. So all of these sources of motivation are affective in nature. And essentially, emotions are woven into the experience of learning all already without any manipulation to the classroom. But as I was finding when I was investigating this, increasingly neuroscience research indicates that the brain systems involved in emotion and those involved in cognition are not as traditional accounts would have us believe, as separate systems pulling in opposite directions. And we're learning that there's a lot of reasons to include emotion in the classroom context. And one of them might be to get students' attention. So we have students in our classroom, and there's all kinds of, external and internal forces that are pulling their attention away from us, whether it's like, their cell phone in their lap, or even the tests they have in the next hour in their biology class. So we're sort of like competing for students' attention, essentially. I hate to look at it like that, but um, and then it also helps maximize the working memory potential. And I know a lot of us in this room know about this next concept, but I'm going to give a quick of it anyway. Um, the useful analogy is an old computer, like when now I have a million tabs open, but it used to be if I had a few tabs, they wouldn't work as well, right? And so this idea is called cognitive load theory, CLT. And, there's intrinsic load, the complexity of new information, germane load, where we're linking new info with current info, and then this extraneous load, so the unnecessary and distracting information. And we want to free up our working memory for the new learning. And these are studies done by Huck and Ludwig in 2009. And so intriguingly, cognitive support, when they were doing their studies, did not predict, did not alone predict student comprehension scores. It was cognitive support plus affective support, and it seemed to result in increased understanding. So only when those were combined, and Huck and Ludwig called it augmented cognitive load theory. So when the two are combined, it seemed to help support learning. Couple more ways that emotions help. They help enhance memory consolidation. So, and to inspire motivation. So these are a few reasons that Kavanaugh lists in her book to include emotions. And what's one of the best ways, I think, to infuse emotion is through storytelling. Infusing a little storytelling. So why stories? According to Zakrzajik and Doyle, or Doyle and Zakrzajik, a good story creates interest. It captures our attention, and capturing attention is really important. The images used in a good story produce a sensory experience, making it easier to recall information. And then good stories create a personal connection, which is important for learning, that personal connection. And we know that stories commonly make an impression with students allowing us an efficient way of storing, retrieving, and conveying information. So I'm tripping over my slides a little bit. So stories yield benefits in learning because instead of the information being presented in discrete, isolated bits, each of which takes up its own slot in our working memory, it is presented in a holistic narrative tied together by meaning, which takes up much less of your working memory and also presumably relates in multiple ways to other threads of information stored in your long-term memory. So basically, stories provide context and meaning to information rather than them presenting them in vague abstractions or bulleted distillations. So stories mentally transport us. This is a big thing. Um, and this is where we're getting into kind of like neuroscience territory, that the transportation of our minds is reflected in changes in our brain activity when we're exposed to stories. So, according to Spear, Reynolds, and Swallow and Zaks, when you watch someone's brain while they read a story, you can virtually watch the story unfolding according to which areas um, of the brain that are activated. So, if a character picks up a spoon, you see activity in the areas of the brain involved in grasping objects. When they navigate spatial terrain, areas involved in spatial navigation light up. So, to the brain, stories are miniature activities. Or miniature experiences, sorry, I should say. And according to Cheap Heath, a professor in Stanford Graduate School of Business, and Dan Heath, a senior fellow at Duke University's Case Center, stories, even boring stories, are sticky. So mental stimulation is not as good as actually doing something, but it's the next best thing. So the authors are suggesting that stories are like flight simulators for our brain. We tell a story about Queen Nefertiti, students are flight simulating. They're imagining what it would be like to be her, to have lived in the era she lived, and that flight simulation makes the idea a bit more sticky, is the terminology that Heath and Heath use. All right. Then a really, really important piece here is that storytelling is a way that people can relate to each other, and stories have long been used as a way to get people thinking about viewpoints beyond their own, as well as to express our experience to others. So not only do stories help students learn, but they also help students connect with others. Really valuable. Terence and Garigulo wrote, "The quickest path between yourself and another person is a story." So stories allow students to share their experiences, consider other perspectives, make connections through associations, cultivate understanding, and increase empathy. So, all great benefits to sort of this community building that we're always trying to do as educators in our classrooms. And I really like this quote. Daniel F. Chambliss and Christopher G. Takacs, sorry about this. My pronunciation today is just silly. Did a 10-year research project studying students in Hamilton College on the nature of collegiate experience. And they found what makes a successful college isn't the number of Nobel Prize winners at the front of classrooms or how many new science buildings are built, although some people might argue that, but rather it is the people. The best predictors of student satisfaction and success are whether students form close-knit friendships, have a mentor or two on campus with whom they develop a close relationship, or find a meaningful social group with which to identify. So, good ways that this community building can help enhance student success. And I'm going to change gears a bit here. So far, we've talked about potential benefits of including emotion and stories in the classroom. Now I'm going to spend time discussing ways to incorporate stories from my own experience and through research. So I'm going to do a bit of an example time, and I'm looking at the chat over here. Um, yeah, I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. Thank you for sharing that quote. I love that Maya Angelou quote. Um, and agreed, immersive games are great vehicles for instruction because they're immersed in a story in these immersive games. So thank you for sharing that as well. Um, and I should add that to my list of ways to incorporate stories into the classroom. So I have three main ways that instructors can incorporate stories into the classroom. And the first is through outside sources. So, um, TED Talks, popular one. I use a couple TED Talks each semester, where they're telling us various stories in these TED Talks. I find them very useful. Common fables. I do a proofreading exercise using the tortoise and the hare, and just it just has all kinds of like spelling and grammar errors in it, and students go through and try and circle all of the errors. Um, Case studies. That's a good one. Bring a case study in. Here's the story. Now try and um, identify how you could help manage this issue. Short stories. You can find some pretty short stories like flash fiction and things online. Poetry is something I like to use regularly because it's condensed and I can bring it to class and we can have a cold read. And, I teach creative writing, but I use poetry in my composition classes, and even in my business writing classes. So, I don't stay away from it in other sort of like genres. And then visiting speakers, another way to bring in sort of outside voices. And, um, outside sources work really well because we don't have to do all the heavy lifting ourselves. Like we don't have to come up with our own stories and figure out, like we can bring in another voice, whether it's a verbal voice or a voice written. So I'm going to read you a poem here. I know this is a kind of a hippy dippy thing to do in a conference presentation, but I'm going to do it anyway. It's a poem that I read every year to my composition classes toward the start of the semester. Um, but before I start it, it's important to know the Icarus myth. And I'm not sure if anyone wants to unmute and quickly tell the Icarus myth to everybody, just in like a quick like 10, 20 seconds, or I can run through it as well if nobody feels like unmuting this early morning. Anybody want to share with us the Icarus myth?
Don't fly too close to the sun.
Yeah, thank you. And that's often what our students remember from it, because we have his dad, who's this important inventor, and he builds these wings out of wax and feathers, and we're gonna escape, right? Um, and whatever you do, Icarus, don't fly too close to the sun. And then he does, and the wax melts, and he plummets to his death. So, um, so yeah, that's the story. And I always like quickly run through the story with my students just so they're remembering it correctly. And the poem I use is Failing and Flying by Jack Gilbert. Everyone forgets that Icarus also flew. It's the same when love comes to an end or the marriage fails and people say they knew it was a mistake, that everybody said it would never work, that she was old enough to know better. But anything worth doing is worth doing badly. Like being there by that summer ocean on the other side of the island while love was fading out of her, the stars burning so extravagantly those nights that anyone could tell you they would never last. Every morning she was asleep in my bed like a visitation, the gentleness in her like antelope standing in the dawn mist. Each afternoon I watched her coming back through the hot stony field after swimming, the sea light behind her and the huge sky on the other side of that. Listened to her while we ate lunch. How can they say the marriage failed? Like the people who came back from Provence when it was Provence and said it was pretty, but the food was greasy. I believe Icarus was not failing as he fell, but just coming to the end of his triumph. So, like I said, I use those this poem in composition classes every year, and I use it to teach hooks, to teach conclusions, to talk about structure, rhetorical strategies like ethos, pathos, and logos, um, similes, fragments, etc. But one important element I always look for is like universal elements. So something that students can relate to in their life. So if I'm bringing in a commercial or something, those are particularly humorous, but I try to find like a universal so that it'll stick with more of the students, something emotionally powerful. And before I go over the next one, I am going to hop over to chat and just read what's going on over there because I think that this is great sharing. Um, so part of a team led by Professor Jane Carlton from Penn State that makes video games for teaching intro to astronomy. The game presents all our usual Astro 001 topics framed in a kind of sci-fi story. Yeah, that's very cool. Thank you for sharing that URL. Um, and working on dissertation, comprehensive game design. Yeah, I love that you all are in here talking about the game design. I think it's such a cool way to immerse students in stories again. Um, so, speaking of immersing in student stories, another way is through student stories. So, we have outside sources, so we don't have to do all the heavy lifting, and then student stories to really let the student voices shine, which is the important part. And so, I've got a few things listed here. Icebreakers, even though it might seem simple, a lot of us do it at the start of the semester. I do it throughout the semester, where I might say, let's share some hoorays at the start of class to try and like bring our mood up. Like, who's having a good day? And students are like, oh, I got an A on my math test, and it's my brother's birthday. Like, they share all kinds of things, and it really helps sort of build that community in the room. Introductory letters to instructor. What has been your experience so far with this class could work in any field, and just sort of asking them, like I teach gen ed classes. So saying, what's your experience with English class been like so far? And, I don't have to ask, but I do because I know that like a few have had really great experiences, but many of them are just like turned off from English in general. Um, Introductory posts, so letters uh, with photos or with video elements that contains a brief biography. I have elevator pitches here. I do this for research with small groups. So we get into small groups and each student does an elevator pitch for what they want to research to me for their research papers. Having students create their own case studies and patient stories with their wealth of experience that they have. Name stories is something that I think is really neat. And I got this idea from Obliageli Sneed, an instructional designer at ASU Online, where as part of the discussion introductions, you and your students can share stories around names, meaning nicknames, what you prefer to be called, pronunciation tips, and it's a natural opportunity to discuss cultural values and different backgrounds, and it's a really neat way to help elevate student stories. Then relate the content to your own life. So, relate what we're talking about to an experience you've had. I know sometimes I forget to do it, like when I'm going through my course content, but I think it can be useful. And what is happening in the world that relates to the course content this week? News stories, blogs, informative videos, infographics, etc. Um, this is Darby and Lang came up with this idea. So a lot of different options, and of course, it's not an all-inclusive list. Yeah. And before I go to the next one, I'll hop over to chat again. I like this sort of pattern. So, yeah, the game like an interactive textbook. The story we do aim for is the emotional. What does this have to do with me? I love that emotional connection to the story and to the course content, right? That's where it leads. And I do this online with my students, part of our informal, non-required discussion board each week. I ask them discussions about recent victories, recent challenges, time management tips, tricks, hacks, something that made them smile, even getting them to weigh in on stupid questions like what color is the number three? Yeah, I love that. I would do that. Um, but yeah, that's part of it. Just that connection that you're building with online students. And I teach a lot of online classes too. So The things I'm talking about aren't just for in person. They work for hybrid or asynchronous classes as well. So now I have a specific example. This is one that I've given to students before. I haven't in a while, but it just relates to, you know, I have a Benjamin Franklin quote here. There are three types of people in the world: those who are immovable, those who are movable, and those who move. As a learner, which category do you fit into and why? So, including reflections on great teachers, peers who supported you, accomplishments, or turning points, right? And I've also done why are you attending college? What has been your experience with this class? What's a creative work that has inspired you? So, just like a little insight on the students and for them to share their own stories. Then one that I also like to use, I mean, and this is just a subtle way, I have essay reflections, and I usually use this one when, toward the end of our research unit, when they're just like, just exhausted. Um, I have them write 6-word reflections, and I could see this being done as like haikus or headlines, right? So they're great informal, formative assessments, and I get a good temperature of how they're feeling. So I give them these examples where I say, here are some examples of 6-word stories: for sale, baby shoes never worn, corpse parts missing, doctor buys yacht, and then Steve ignores editor word limit, and then Dorothy F it, I'll stay here. And so then I have them write about their researching process. And these are some of my student examples from a semester or two ago. I'm not going to read all of them. I'll just read a few. But it's possible. Just make it simple, the bolded one. Changed my mind like a million times. He struggled, then light bulb moment. Why is this easy but hard? Crap, tomorrow? Aha, no more procrastination. Um, so again, you can see how even with 6 words, I get a good temperature for how they're feeling about this process once we get to the end of it. And then I have the proofreading process, which comes, I usually get some pretty funny responses for this one. Um, Check grammar first, ER. Wait, grammar, AR first, right? If it looks good, I win. Give me 20 more words. Wait, what did I just say? Um, MLA citation is confusing and difficult. If it ain't broke, why fix it? So again, they come up with like really creative things, and I always make sure to share these with them afterwards, and we kind of have a good like, ooh, look at us telling the story as a class about the proofreading process. Um, and they seem to really lean into that. Then lastly, instructor stories. Okay. And so I have here introductory video letter. I know video or letter. I know most of us do this. I typically do both. Um, Conversational off the cuff stories like, hey, on my way in, I saw this thing on the billboard, or right, I like this happened with my son or my dog today. Um, a hook at the start of class. I like this one because you can have like a statistic or a focus question for the class. Like this is going to be the story of the class or of this big concept we're going to be talking about, and it doesn't have to be long. We're just looking at flash fiction, very, very short. Humor, I don't consider myself super funny, but this is a good way into emotion. So I often defer to like movie references. And students get it. They love The Office and, different sort of like pop culture movies. I'll say, what is we're fine, or so much room for activities. And many of them know what I'm talking about. Just a little sort of like thing to keep their attention. Personal stories of my own writer's block, or the time an instructor put a big red X through one of my paragraphs and said, I don't see how this supports the thesis, so it's not going to count toward your word count. I like to tell that story because I'm like, explanations are important. So personal stories, effective, and I'll talk about a personal story from a construction instructor at Madison College a bit later. Friday videos. I have Michelle L. Botner, associate professor of Clemson, uses Friday videos where she uses them for announcements, but it's more to share stories, something she finds motivating. It might even be things from her personal life. And I I think that's a really neat idea that I haven't implemented well, but I really want to in my online asynchronous classes. And then the essential questions are the course theme. So what's the story, the class, the unit, or the lesson is telling? I think that's a useful question for us to ask ourselves when we're entering into any, sort of new class or new unit. And then that's those are the instructor stories I have. So I'm going to it might be dangerous to stop sharing here because I had it all set up before. Uh, but I think I will anyway. So what I'm going to do, or perhaps I won't, and I won't tempt fate. It's not tempt fate. And I already did by messing with it, didn't I? That's okay. Okay. So, I'm just going to tell a story right now that I tell to, um, to my students. And I know you're seeing my slides over here. Right, you're seeing my instructor slides. All right. Yep. Yeah, you are. What a funny thing. All right. So what I'm going to do here is go into my mid-semester story, and I'm just going to keep going with this, and I'm going to stay into it. And like I said, not mess fate. I'm used to using Microsoft Teams or WebEx, and so Zoom is a fun thing. Display settings and set miner, yeah. Yeah, I will here in a minute. I'll tell you the story first. So, this is a story that I like to tell in person, but if I tell it in line, typically I have my face as the big part of it. And so um I tell this toward the middle, in between the middle and the end semester, when students are starting to feel like overwhelmed and stressed. And, it doesn't necessarily relate to the course content as much as it relates to their well-being. So I end class and say, okay, let's put our stuff away. I have a story to tell you. And I, I used to live in Texas. I lived in Texas for like 15 years. And I just sort of explain, the infrastructures on the roads can get tricky if it's like pouring rain. There's a river on the side of like I-35. So it's the infrastructures aren't really built for inclement weather like snow and ice or rain. And when I first moved there, I used to work as a bartender, and one of my friends there told me this true story. So she was driving home late one night and it was dark outside, and she was driving her car, driving. And then she, it was like really pitch black. She's driving home in the country. And then suddenly her car hits um water. And she's like, "What? This isn't supposed to be there?" And she um tries to reverse, but the water's rising really quickly. And so she can't. And her car's just kind of getting swept. And it starts to rise more and more, starts to come in through her door. And she realizes, like, I think I need to get to the top on the roof of my car because this is getting sort of like dangerous here. So she rolls down her window, puts her purse around her neck, climbs out of her window, gets on top of the car, and sits there. And she's like, okay, I'll call for help. She goes to get her cell phone out, and her cell phone is dead. So she can't call anybody. So she's like, I'll wait. Somebody will come and get me for sure. Like someone will see me out here and be able to call for help. So she waits and waits and waits, waits and waits and waits. And then the sun starts peeking up over the horizon. And she says, all right, like, I didn't want to swim before because even though I'm a strong swimmer, I couldn't see, and there was probably debris in the water, but I think I'm gonna go for it now because I can see the water is like not as strong as it was, and I'm gonna go for it because nobody seems to be coming. So she gets down in the water, swims off, makes it to the side of the river that's there. And she climbs out. She's soaking wet. And she's like, okay, now what? I thought I saw a gas station 2 miles-ish back, right? She's like, I'm going to start walking that way. So she starts walking, and walks and walks and walks and ends up at this gas station. And she walks up to the front door, goes to open it to be like, can I use your phone? And the door's locked. It's not open yet. It's so early in the morning. And she's like, dang it. So then she looks at the side of the parking lot and sees a payphone. And it's like even 10, 15 years ago, payphones were pretty like obsolete, right? 15 years ago. But she saw one there and she's like, what the heck? Do I have change for a payphone? She looks in her wallet and goes, okay, I've got the change. Now who can I call? All my family lives in Arizona. I don't have anyone's number memorized. So then she um, remembers that a childhood friend lives like 30 minutes away and she remembers the number. Ooh, I'll try her. So she gets on the payphone, she calls her, and her friend answers and is like, oh my gosh, I'll come get you. And she's like, whew, my ordeal is over, right? So she sits down on the curb to relax. And about 10 or 15 feet to the side, like if you're looking at like in your office, look at the wall, look at a chair or something, and the bush starts rustling violently right by her. And she's like, what? And then she looks over and out jumps this humongous raccoon. And for any of you who've ever met a mama raccoon, they're pretty mean. And so the raccoon starts sprinting at my friend. And my friend stands up and points her finger and says, not today, raccoon. And the raccoon stopped, looked at her, and went, I had the nod, and walked back into the bush. And that's the end of the story, but students are always like, "What, is this real?" I'm like, "Yeah, this is real." But I tell it and I tell them this because sometimes you can tell the universe to give you a break. Like when you've had the worst, um, day of your life, you can say, all right, not today, universe, not today, raccoon. And I tell this story, I started telling it over 10 years ago, and I still tell it, and it continues to resonate with students. I even got a card last semester from a student that was like, I still remember that raccoon story you told. Thank you so much. I love that story. So they are interested in it. And then when I see toward when I'm done telling the story, I can like visibly see their shoulders drop, like this sort of like, I'm relaxed, like, okay, I can go tell the universe, like, I'm stressed, but give me a break today. Um, and again, it's just meant to like build community and kind of give a little bit of a pep talk toward the end of the semester. So I'm going to talk about what kind of stories work well. And I am going to mess with it for just a second.
Go back to that screen and then do the drop-down display settings like Jamie mentioned.
Which one?
Just go back to that screen that you had where you click the presenter view.
Sure. And then go to,
Well, when you're in that black screen, you'll see display settings as a drop-down.
yeah. All right. I don't know that I am. Let me see if this will work.
Yeah, so now in the middle, you see display settings next to show taskbar up at the top.
Got it. Got it. That's it, right? Y'all are seeing the right thing now?
Yep, all good.
Thank you so much. Who told me that?
Bubble yum.
Bubblegum. Thank you. Um, like I said, I didn't want to tempt fate, and then I did it anyway. But I appreciate your help. So, what kind of stories work well? This is sort of some like practical tips, and then we'll get into the chatting part. Virtually any kind. They don't have to be dramatic. They don't have to be captivating. They don't have to be entertaining. The story form does most of the heavy lifting. Often, even boring stories will be stickier than a set of facts, and that's comforting for those of us who don't consider ourselves great storytellers or dramatists, which I don't necessarily, right? But I guarantee you that of all the things I talked about in my English classes, like that's one of the things they probably remember, the raccoon story. So quick tips, keeping it simple. Um, what do you want your students to take away from the story? So always have some kind of mission, anchor info in what the students already know. Analogies work really well. Highlight the unexpected. So some specific knowledge they're missing. if you can take a turn, like I'm telling this long, boring story about a flood, then suddenly a raccoon jumps out and sprints at my friend, right? Um, Keep it credible. So, your own experience, something you saw, something with a testable credential, relate it to the class and students if needed. Again, the raccoon story doesn't really relate, but um, it had a targeted purpose in mind. And yeah. Um, Universal moments or messages. That's something I try to look for. So something that creates commonalities, builds common ground, be as specific as possible. So if you're using statistics, also tell that human side of the story, right? That part that helps us visualize as a person and not just a number. Include emotion. Again, that helps make the ideas sticky using like some kind of emotion, surprise, humor, and do what works best with your teaching style. Um, like if you're like, I'm never going to tell a personal, long, windy story that doesn't relate to class, that's totally fine. Don't reinvent the wheel. Bring in those outside sources I talked about. And then lastly, let the students' voices shine. They want to tell their stories. Their stories are important. Let them have the floor first because they've had plenty of real world experience. And if they weren't through that experience, they know somebody who's had that experience. And I think it's really important to sort of elevate our student stories and let them shine and not turn it into like, this is my show where I'm going to tell all my stories constantly and just overwhelm your voices. Um, so here's the list in its entirety. And I wanted to chat a bit right now about, and I know you all are already sharing in chat, but if anybody wants to share via audio, how you view storytelling in your teaching and how you plan or how you plan to use storytelling in the future, like a technique you hadn't thought of, either that I mentioned or that somebody else has mentioned. Would anyone like to share?
I can share one experience I had in the classroom. Can you hear me okay?
Sure, that's
Um,
great.
I did a lot of trials at gamification over the years, and one particular semester I didn't have a lot of time, and I was going to gamify the LMS, but I didn't have time to put any mechanics. So it was purely story driven. I took
Uh-huh.
the class, I made a map of a fictional world, and then for each objective in biology, there was a quest, there was a reason why to learn the material, to solve a problem, to cure a plague, etc. So it had each section of biology went along with the story, context to the material they were learning.
Yeah,
So it didn't have a lot of agency for the students. It was a little bit railroaded because the story was kind of linear.
yeah,
So it was a lot. I learned a lot from it. I
yeah,
think they enjoyed the story, but I think that the story without the agency and the choices that come with the mechanics of a game remove them a little bit from immersion. So they may relate to characters, but from other efforts where I had both, it seems that the two coupled together story with some agency for the students to be involved within the story seem
yeah.
to be even more effective. So just sharing that experience.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you for sharing. And I think that's a part of letting the student voices shine, like this idea that they can have agency in the story too. Um, I think that's really cool. Thank you for sharing. Would anyone else like to share? While you all are deciding, I'll share a story from John Stephanie, who's a construction and remodeling instructor at Madison College. Um, and he shared at the end of a session I gave at Madison College about how, the importance of being willing to be vulnerable because he teaches an OSHA safety class, which is like, and he always tells this story to his students because he's like, yeah, I can just have a list of don't do this, do this, do this. But he said, he tells a story where he was framing a roof at the end of a day, and on the roof, um, a guy lost his hammer and it hit another guy who was walking below 2 stories down. The guy had a hard hat on, but it knocked him off his feet. And he said it felt like you dropped a concrete block on my head. And the guy was fine, but without his helmet, he probably wouldn't have been. And he likes to tell that story because he says they don't remember the long list of, this is why a helmet is so important. But if you tell them these stories from your real experience in construction, they go, oh, yeah, helmet, because the hammer falling off the roof, right? So something stickier. Who else would like to share? I know you all have already done a lot of sharing in the chat.
Well, I've excuse me. I've referred to this game for teaching astronomy we made, but just to sort of fill in more detail about it, it's all set in a sci-fi near future, and the student, the player, um, creates a main character that they can customize themselves, give them, their own name or
Hmm.
want, and they play the part of a student in the exchange program to the University of Mars. So, the whole game sort of goes from there and traveling the solar system and so forth. Um, and so the game is kind of on the rails just because it has to get through this progression of lessons. But at the end of each main unit, there's an assignment where we call them reflection assignments, where students can essentially respond to a prompt that has something to do with the story, but as if, writing or recording a video or audio as if they were their character in the games. So
Oh.
it would be like, okay, and the first one is like, write a letter home, telling folks, okay, what's it been like living on Mars? Or later in the game, there's like this, discovering an extraterrestrial organism. It's like, okay, if that were you, how would you actually handle that? And
Yeah.
what do you think the effect would be? And things like that. So that's kind of where they get to put more personality into it, and a lot of them do. So
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for sharing. And I love I didn't read through the whole thing you put in chat, but I love how the things you talked about in chat are very universal elements, like we're all, all of us, what happens with the primordial mixture of hydrogen and helium evolves for so long. So, yeah, I think that just having that common thread, like here we all are, come from this part of it, and then that you're able to weave in um stories in such an interesting way, like layered stories. I love that. Thank you so much.
yes, sir. And if I may,
Yeah.
I'd just like to plug this. So first of all, credit where due. Dr. Jane Charlton, I mentioned, has wanted to make games for teaching astronomy for 30 years or
Yeah.
more. And, it was only within the last 10 or 15 we identified a pretty accessible means of doing it, which is the so-called Unity game engine.
Hmm.
Um, and just for anyone who's interested, if you're considering making a educational video game, odds are in your own department or among your students, you have like skill sets that you don't know about, because why would you yet? But there are probably students in your class that have dabbled with making games using Unity, and folks who, DM for D&D games, who like to write stories and create worlds and things like that. So, outsource it. You don't have to do
Yeah.
all kinds of things alone.
Yeah, and they can contribute directly to the story. Awesome. Thank you for sharing. Um, we are, I think, coming to the end of the time here, so I'm just going to share one final thought. For us, the instructors, your influence as a teacher is going to be most profound based on who you are as a person. That is, skills are really, really important, but who we are and who we're becoming as people, that will have the greatest impact on our students. So, again, thank you all for being here. If you do have questions, I think like the recording needs to be stopped, but you're welcome to stay after and chat with me for a few minutes. I'd be happy to chat with anyone who wants to stay.
Oh, Allie, thank you so much. This is very good for this time of the morning.
Yeah, little storytelling.
Yeah, very good. I'm so glad you did this for us. So thank
Yeah,
you
thank you
very
for
much.
having me. I really appreciate it.
Okay, folks, top of the hour. We've got another session coming our way.